Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Agti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
In this episode, Trishul and Aaron get wonky as they try to explain modern monetary theory. They introduce the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. And they try to explain how fiat currency, currency issuers, national debt, federal deficits, and debt service are all related. They discuss Stephanie Kelton's new book, The Deficit Myth, and some of the concerns of MMT. If deficits are not inherently good or bad, do you trust Congress to spend your hard-earned money wisely? And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Agti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area, and I'm here with Trishul Patel, a wealth manager on the East Coast.
Hey, Aaron, great to be here today, and thanks everybody for listening.
Great to be here as well. Today, we are going to get a little wonky, and I use that phrase specifically because we're going to be talking about economics and macroeconomics and trying to give an introduction of modern monetary theory. Now, Trishul and I are not economists, but we do read books by economists. So any errors will most likely be on our part, not the economist's part that we're referencing. But we're going to try and give an introduction on modern monetary theory, in part because you're probably going to be learning more about this and seeing this in the news as we move forward. And also, as people try to study the impact of the recent $1 trillion stimulus packages. So the main idea with modern monetary theory is that when you understand the United States is a currency issuer, so they're issuing the currency and their debt is in that same currency, then they're paying the debt with dollars that they can print. And also, given that the US has a fiat currency, which means that a dollar is worth a dollar because everyone agrees it's worth a dollar, that there's no backing, there's no gold standard for that. It's not tied to anything else. That we, as a society and the federal government, can issue more debt and then can print more dollars to pay off that debt. And this is already getting a little wonky, I can feel. So I have to explain all of these things so that you understand them. But the idea here is the US government does not necessarily need to be constrained in its spending because of the national debt and or deficits. The US government can issue that debt and pay off that debt, and if there becomes a problem in the future, it can print more dollars to pay off that debt. So if you understand that you don't need to necessarily constrain the deficits purely from a monetary perspective, then this kind of opens up different avenues for how the government chooses to spend money and actually becomes a fiscal conversation. So we're going to try and explain all these components, but it's the idea that as long as you have a currency issuer, again, the US and a few other countries around the world, issuing debt in their own currency, and they can always print more dollars, then deficits don't matter the way you think they do. They still do, but it's not going to be an ongoing concern. It's not going to be something that cripples society. And in fact, in a recent book called The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, there's the argument that federal deficits can actually help the economy and get through these rough times to make sure that the economy is continually growing. So, Trishul, of the things I just mentioned, and that's not a full introduction. We still have to go into a little more detail. Are there any of those components that you want to explain in a little more detail?
Yeah, great introduction, Aaron. I think we should probably lay a little bit of groundwork on just the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy. These are the two key ways that the government uses at their disposal to kind of influence the economy. So, as a quick overview, monetary policy is the policy of managing our money supply. And this is handled by the Federal Reserve. And the goal here is to just make sure that our money is stable. And it can also be used to keep growth at a stable rate, meaning not too fast and not too slow, keeping the economy and GDP going smoothly and growing smoothly. And also to keep concerns of inflation or recessions under control. So we don't want to end up in too high of an extreme, meaning things are growing too quickly or too slow. And with inflation, we don't want prices going up too much or, in fact, going down. But a little bit of inflation is okay. So that's kind of the goal of the Federal Reserve in its handling of monetary policy.
Okay, so monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, keeping the economy and our currency stable, trying to kind of keep an eye on jobs and unemployment because that is a big part of the economy, keeping an eye on inflation because if everything's going well, then there's more money to spend on fewer goods, so that's going to be an inflation issue. But if things are going bad, then keep an eye on recession and try and make sure that the economy is still growing.
Right. And the knobs that the Federal Reserve has at its disposal are things that you may have heard in the papers and things like that about setting the discount rate, which is the rate that the banks pay to the federal government to borrow. So that's part of what helps set the rates for the overall economy. And then there's also this notion of the reserve ratio. And this is the amount that banks need to hold back and not lend out. So there are just a few knobs like this that the Fed has at its disposal to kind of keep the gas on the economy, but not pedal to the metal and not to have the brakes full on. And these types of policies, in theory, are supposed to be independent from politics, in air quotes.
Is this also where quantitative easing came into play? Was that a monetary decision?
Yeah, for sure. There's this concept of having a tight monetary policy, and there's this concept of having an easy monetary policy. So with a tight monetary policy, you want to tightly control the money supply, and you want to kind of slow things down a bit. And with an easy policy or an easing policy, you want to help stimulate the economy, make things easier for people to lend. And that's how quantitative easing kind of plays in, meaning providing this amount of liquidity for growth in the economy.
Okay.
But monetary policy is probably a larger conversation. And we'll probably dig into the nuances that are involved there in a different or later episode. But then there's this notion of fiscal policy. And this actually refers to just government spending and taxing. This is the government budget and how that's handled. At a high level, the government taxes individuals and households and corporations. We've covered that. So it brings in revenue. And then it does a whole lot of spending. And then the way it kind of works is if it spends a lot more than it brings in, then it has to borrow. And this borrowing on an annual basis is known as the deficit, the amount of money that we must borrow each year to cover the difference between the money that the government spends versus the money it takes in. And those deficits get piled on year over year to create our national debt.
Okay, so monetary policy is the Federal Reserve, focused on stabilizing economy and currency. Fiscal policy is more Congress, so kind of tax revenue, which they have control of, that they get to decide tax rates. And spending policies. So kind of let's do tax revenues line up with spending. Every year there seems to be a deficit. And so that deficit gets added to our national debt.
Right. And just to provide some high-level context of, like the dollars and cents involved with these accounting figures, currently our national debt is 26 trillion and change. And what that also means is on a per citizen basis, meaning each individual who's alive in this country that's a citizen, that's about 80,000 per US citizen. Meaning that the moment you're born, you're born with 80,000 debt attached to your forehead, I guess. And that's just on behalf of your government.
Okay. So national debt is $80,000 per US citizen. Do you have any context for that? Does it feels a little weird to think that everyone's in the hole on average. What do we have, like a average net worth number or a kind of asset per citizen?
To add that into just a few other numbers, that's just the government debt, or the federal government debt to be more specific. But then, of course, households have their own debt in form of like credit cards and bank loans and mortgages and things like that. So you add up all of that together, so that 26 trillion jumps up to about 80 trillion. What that means is there's a lot of additional debt that is circulating around. But at the same time, yes, individuals and households and citizens have assets to hopefully offset that debt and then some. So in terms of assets per citizen, that's around 396,000. So that sounds a little better, meaning the moment you're born, you have also assets on average. Now, of course, you as an individual baby may not, but we're talking about in the average case, have about 400,000 in assets.
Okay, so the average citizen does have a positive, it's not really net worth, but because it's including government debt, and we're assigning that to people. But just the idea that there is more total assets than our total debt, and almost 4 times as much. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that sounds about right in terms of assets per federal or national debt. Okay. Now, the other, just on a total basis, we mentioned that the 24 trillion is for the federal government, the 80 trillion total debt in the US. Well, then the total amount of national assets is around 130 trillion, just so that we have those big numbers in mind.
Okay. So one of the aspects of modern monetary theory to understand, we'll try and use MMT, that's the acronym throughout this podcast, but one of the aspects, or one of the components to help understand how it works, is when you look at deficits, there are 3 components within the money supply that have to balance out, kind of the way the money supply works, and it's kind of by definition. There's the government spending or deficit, there's the private surplus or deficit, and trade surplus or deficit. So the idea is that if there's money coming into the country via a trade surplus, then there's extra money there. It could be possible for both to have a extra money for private side to spend or save and kind of build their net worth, or for the government to have a surplus as well. But if there's a trade deficit, or at the very least, let's say if the trade is exactly neutral, then for private citizens to be able to save money, which means that they are spending less than they are earning, kind of by definition, there has to be a federal deficit. That if trade is exactly even, same amount of money coming in and out of the country, then for private side, private citizens and corporations, to have a surplus, which means that they can save, they're spending less than they're bringing in, to have that surplus, then there has to be a federal deficit. And these have to balance out. And we'll provide some notes and explanations in our show notes. But then once you add a trade deficit, which it does look like the US is going to have for the foreseeable future, it further compounds the idea that for the private side to save anything moving forward, there has to be a federal deficit. And we actually have seen this play out in reverse in the past, where when there is a federal surplus, if there's also a trade deficit, that actually means that the private side takes on the deficit. The private side sees assets and net worth go down because they're putting more money into the government in terms of tax dollars than they're getting out. And by government spending, the most common one is just hiring government employees and paying for services and goods that then go to corporations. So if you were to think any kind of government spending, it's going to something on the private side, whether it's a corporation that hires employees, whether it's goods that go to the individuals who produce those goods, or it's the spending on salaries of government employees. So any government spending is going to the private side. And from the private side to the government, it's usually taxes. So if there's a government surplus, it means that the government is collecting more in taxes than they are spending on and giving money back to the private side. So if we want to see the private side grow and to be able to save, this is again corporations and citizens, then as long as we have a trade deficit, which does look like it will be for the foreseeable future, we need a federal deficit to support that private growth. Do you understand that concept? Did I explain that well enough, Trishul?
Yeah, I think that provides a good understanding of why a deficit may exist, and also the fact that why a deficit isn't necessarily a bad thing, meaning it may be something that helps not only balance the math, but kind of fills in that gap, that, as you mentioned, in terms of if we're running a trade deficit, that gap needs to be filled somewhere.
Okay. Now, the kind of final part of MMT is if we want to have a surplus on the private side and we have a trade deficit and we're going to have this federal deficit kind of every year, how does that impact the national debt that you mentioned? And how does that impact the economy moving forward? And the key here is focusing on the debt service. So this is a percentage of government spending or percentage of tax revenue that goes towards the interest on the debt. So when we see that national debt has a $26 trillion number, we're not paying off $26 trillion in any given year. We're actually just paying the interest on that. Kind of like having an interest-only loan, but again, that's not a perfect analogy, but we're only paying the interest on that. And as long as that debt service remains manageable, the amount of tax revenue and spending and how much we're paying on interest on that debt as a percentage of that tax revenue and spending, then we can keep managing to add to that deficit each year. We can or use a deficit to add to that debt to each year. Because when we go back to the monetary policy, the US government gets to decide the interest rate on its own debt. So as long as the economy is growing, and this is an oversimplification, but very roughly, as long as GDP growth is greater than the interest rate we're paying on debt, then we'll always be able to manage a federal deficit and see the economy grow. And we'll kind of unpack this a little bit, and I want to reiterate, because the US government, the Federal Reserve, gets to decide the interest rate on our debt, if the economy is slowing down, the Federal Reserve gets to lower the interest rate that we're paying, is to kind of make sure that the interest rate is always less than GDP. Now, this doesn't quite work with recessions where you can't lower the interest rate lower than zero, but GDP growth can go negative. That's a recession. But this is where things like quantitative easing come into play. So there are other tools that the Federal Reserve has. But as long as GDP growth, which is going to be a big factor in tax revenue, so if GDP is growing, then tax revenues are growing. So even if our deficit or our debt service is growing in nominal dollars, as long as it remains a manageable percentage, the debt service is a manageable percentage of our tax revenue, then it's okay to continue on this path. So do you understand kind of how debt service is an important part of MMT and understanding that and how it relates to monetary policy and tax revenue? Does that kind of make sense to you, Trishul?
Yeah. So let's provide a few numbers just to put all of this into context. As we mentioned, we had about 26 trillion and change in our national debt, and the interest that the government is paying on that debt is about 336 billion a year. Sounds like a pretty big number, but a few things to realize. That interest as a percent of that debt is only about 1.3%. Here's the interesting part, though. That's less than the inflation rate, meaning or the rate of inflation, call it 2 to 3%, is higher than the level of interest that we have to pay. Meaning, even if we pay that level of interest, the actual amount of debt that we have might be going down. Scratch your head on that because the value of that debt is less.
So the nominal dollars are going up just because we're still adding to the national debt via deficits, but our assets are growing faster than the debt is increasing because, again, inflation. So as long as inflation is greater than that 1.3%, then our national debt as a percentage of our assets is going down.
Yeah. So the way to think about that is put that in the context of, just having a house. And let's say you have a mortgage on the house, you have to pay back $100,000, and your interest rate is, call it 1.3%, call it 1%. Well, what happens if inflation is 2%? Well, you still owe that 100,000, but in the following year, that 100,000 is only worth 98,000 in real dollars. And if you pay that 1%, well, you paid 1% on a smaller mortgage amount. It's interesting how that works. And if you can keep these numbers kind of in check as we're kind of talking through this, then debt can keep going up as long as your interest payments are sensible with respect to the growth of the economy and inflation.
Okay. So going back to the nominal dollar explanation, if we had a mortgage of $100,000 and a home value of $500,000, and we paid 1% on interest of our mortgage, we paid $1,000. It's 1% of 100,000, but our $500,000 asset went up 2%. So that went up to $510,000, which means our equity went from 400 to 410. So we paid $1,000 in interest, but our equity went from 400 to 410. So we gained at $9,000, even though we paid $1,000.
Right. So as long as you're gaining more than you're paying, it seems like a win-win.
Okay, so do I have you at least convinced on how MMT works?
Yeah, I think so far we've laid a pretty good foundation.
Okay, so big criticisms, and these are very, very important to take into account. One is, it sounds like my solution for anytime the government is borrowing money is just printing more money. And that sounds like a recipe for disaster when it comes to inflation. That it sounds like that's why we have hyperinflation in other third world countries around the world, and everyone's thinking about the trillion-dollar bills that come out of Zimbabwe. And this is a very real concern. Now, in the short term, in the immediate, it does not look like it's a concern. So as of right now, it is not particularly a concern this year or probably next year, where we have this trillion-dollar surplus. Inflation now is not a concern. But it does mean that instead of having deficit hawks pay attention to the raw dollars of the deficit, we do need to be paying attention to inflation, because that is a realistic concern. So MMT is not necessarily the opportunity to spend as much as you want. There are still constraints, but it's not the deficit or the national debt that's the constraint. It's the GDP versus interest rate constraint, where if inflation starts to get too high, and one of the ways to curb inflation that the Federal Reserve has used historically is raising interest rates, and that works fairly well to curb interest rates. If we get to this point where interest rates are kind of getting higher, that GDP can't stay above it, that's a real concern. And we kind of saw this play out in the 70s a little bit. And this is where you had interest rates in the double digits. You had mortgages caught at a 15% interest rate. But that was okay because your government bonds were also paying between 15 and 18%, or 12 to 18%, depending on the risk level of the bond. So just all the interest rates were that high, but you saw inflation has really affected gas prices and other real resources, and that hurt the economy pretty hard. So there was pretty good monetary policy then of using rising interest rates to help curb inflation, but under MMT, that becomes a harder constraint. Now, so we do have to worry about inflation. So that's one really big concern when it comes to MMT. The other big concern is we talked about monetary versus fiscal policy. And one of the things I like that Trishul, you pointed out, was that the Federal Reserve is an independent body from Congress. The Federal Reserve sets interest rates and tries to stabilize the money supply through its own knobs and levers. A lot of MMT puts the kind of inflation and spending constraints on to Congress and becomes part of fiscal policy, where now you could see a variety of Congress people realize, oh, I can kind of fund whatever little project I want, And for each individual congressperson, that may be true. But when you start up adding up all of their projects, then you get to this possibility of frivolous spending. And theoretically, this is very, very theoretical. Then I mention that because I don't actually think it's practical. If all these projects were things like infrastructure projects that did lead to other economic growth, then it's possible that, again, that GDP could outpace interest rates and inflation. That's still possible. Realistically, I don't know that I trust Congress to spend responsibly if they realize that there's no monetary constraints on their spending. So I'm curious, given those two criticisms between inflation and fiscal responsibility, how does that impact your view on MMT?
Well, I think inflation is definitely the key to kind of hone in on, as you have said. So to put it a little more concretely, we said government takes in money and they do a lot of spending. And if they need to spend more, they can borrow and they can print more money as well. And, the classical economics 101 concern is that if you just keep printing more money, you put more money out there, that'll cause prices to go up, therefore inflation. So that there's this high level constraint to kind of think about. And one way to think about when you borrow money, that's basically saying it's like a tax that gets deferred into the future, meaning you're going to have to pay that back at some point. And the way I like to think about inflation is it's kind of also like a hidden tax, because what's going on there is the value of everybody's money is going down a bit. So where's that money going? Well, it's going on the spending that the government is spending on. So it's kind of like a backhanded way of taxing individuals. And I personally feel like it's actually a tax that ends up, we've talked a lot about income inequality. I think it does end up disproportionately affecting individuals with less wealth. And the reason I say that is because if you have a certain amount of money and most of your money is in like a bank account, for example, you're earning a pretty low interest rate. And it's probably less than the rate of inflation, meaning your money is frankly worth less and less every year. And that's likely true if you're not wealthy. However, if you're wealthy, we've mentioned this in the past, your wealth is growing at a much higher rate, higher than GDP at the market rate. So a good way as financial planners, we understand to help protect against inflation erosion or price erosion is to invest in the market itself. Companies tend to outpace inflation over time, and that's what the wealthy get to do. So they don't really get hurt as much by this extra taxation, air quotes, by the government in terms of inflation, but it does, I think, likely affect the poor. Now, at the end of the day, maybe it is not so bad because many of these government programs can be used to help out individuals that are less wealthy. So that could be a good reason why it still makes sense. But I think just putting a little light on where this inflation is coming from and who it's impacting is sensible.
So in the book, The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, this is one of her suggestions. She specifically talks about the idea that fiscal responsibility and kind of deficit hawks should not be a political issue. That if the governing body realizes it can spend money, then constraint for the sake of constraint is not necessary. And now becomes a values conversation and having discussions within Congress and across political parties of what should we spend the money on. So it is transferring some of that onus and responsibility from just we can't spend too much to like, well, we can spend more. It's okay to have a deficit. What would be the best use of that money? Now, she says she is politically agnostic, but she has also been a economic advisor to various Democratic government officials, including, I believe, the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. And one of her suggestions was something actually that we've talked about in the past, but slightly different. Trishul had mentioned a universal basic income or a negative income tax, and he did a pretty good job of convincing me of the benefits. She proposes something like a federal jobs guarantee. And here the idea would be if you do not have a job through a private sector, there will be a guaranteed job from the federal government. And the idea here is it should work well with the natural ebbs and flows of the economy and the market cycle, that when the economy is doing very well and companies are hiring people and everything's going smoothly, there shouldn't be very much additional spending by the federal government. That everyone's employed or unemployment's very low. So it's okay that the government's spending less. And that's why the ideal time, it's when the economy is not doing well and people are getting laid off, then the federal government steps in and starts hiring those people. That's the time to increase spending. And you get this natural kind of reversion to the mean, but it's accelerating it, where as soon as companies start laying off people and the government starts hiring them back, it helps stabilize the economy, where there's still enough money going into households to support spending and support the economy. And again, theoretically, if these people are hired for infrastructure projects that can further help grow the economy, things just like improving roads, improving public goods and parks, and improving communication technology, improving health. Like there's a lot of infrastructure projects that can use to just improve society. Then you could get this stabilization of unemployment where the government spending is inversely correlated to the public spending and or private spending and the economy. So you get this natural, when the economy is doing well, government spending is going to be less because they don't have to hire as many people. But when the economy is doing poorly, this is the specific time for the federal government to step in and hire those people. So this was one example of a way to implement MMT that is not monetarily constrained. It's a fiscal discussion around values. So what are your first thoughts when you hear the idea of a federal jobs guarantee as compared to some of our past discussions, especially related to UBI?
I see some sense in that. At a high level, the big picture I see as if we want something that's good for the overall US economy today and on a go-forward basis, we have to realize there will be times when things are good and the market is pushing forward and unemployment is low. But then there will be cycles where, or periods where the economy does go through a rough patch that can last a protracted amount of time. And it's during these periods where the GDP growth can slow down and people can be out of jobs, and there will be concerns about actually being able to find a job. And this can all lead to lower spending, lower confidence, and kind of like a vicious downward cycle.
Mm-hmm.
But if individuals have the opportunity to find a job quickly with the government and keep their household going in a smooth pace and being able to pay rent checks on time, it sounds like a good solution to me, especially if this money has a positive net benefit for the government. And what I mean by this is there are programs that the governments can set up, and there is spending that the government can do where each dollar it puts into that program, it might actually get more than a dollar out in terms of future tax revenue. So one way to think about that is it's just an investment on behalf of the government or from the government on behalf of the citizens that ends up providing a net benefit over time. So when spending is done from that perspective, I think it does make sense to me. For example, this was kind of looked at by a few researchers not too long ago. And what they were looking to see is how do these types of government programs do over time? So this was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics not too long ago by two researchers from Harvard. And they looked at about 100 different government programs since like the 60s. And they asked this very important question. Is the government getting out more than they put in? On balance, how are these programs working out over long periods of time? Are they leading to more benefits for the actual government themselves in terms of these less visible things like longer term tax revenue than the actual dollars they spent initially? And I think this type of research is sensible because clearly there are efficient ways to spend money and there are inefficient ways to spend money, and you can't spend the same dollar twice.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, I think if we have some understanding that infrastructure or some other types of government jobs are sensible, certainly it makes sense to me. But then there are also, again, inefficient ways to spend money that I would also be concerned about as well. At the end of the day, what we're looking at right now, for example, is we have about 6 trillion in spending, and the amount of money that the government is taking in is about only 3.5 to 4 trillion. So there's a kind of pretty big hole that is there, and we want to just kind of ensure, I hope, that that hole is being filled with spending that we think is going to be additive to our future growth. And there might be projects or initiatives that we've decided to take on where that may not be the case. So hopefully evidence is driving those decisions, and hopefully less emotions are. Some big ticket items that always come up are Medicare, Social Security, and defense. So those are 3 large budget items respectively. They account for about 1.3 trillion for Medicare, Medicaid, another trillion or so for Social Security, and about 700 billion a year for defense spending. And we want to ensure that we're probably getting more out of those than we're putting in. I think probably the trickier one to measure is that defense spending. Are we getting a good ROI on something that's a little fuzzy to measure? There were some articles not too long ago about the totals we spent, for example, on Iraq and Afghanistan, trying to stabilize those regions and hopefully make us safer. And so far, the total accounting across the decade or so we've been working at this is about $6 trillion. I hope somebody making these policy decisions is kind of scratching their heads on the ROI on something like that. So $6 trillion is, compared to our total debt, a pretty good amount so far. And I kind of just ran a few numbers to see what that even entails. So this is for wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for wars in air quote, because they haven't actually been officially declared, but maybe as a dollar amount they have. There's about 32 million people in Afghanistan, 40 million in Iraq. And in terms of a household basis, about 10 million households in Afghanistan and about 12 million households in Iraq. And I just wondered, how much have we spent per household in these countries? Meaning we've spent about 270,000 per Afghan or Iraq household on this war. And then I just thought, okay, well, what's the 3% rule applied to that 270,000? Well, that basically means that instead of spending 6 trillion on that war, we could have paid for a UBI for every household in Iraq and Afghanistan of about $8,000 inflation adjusted on a go forward basis for at least the next 60 to 100 years.
So you're wondering if just giving poor people more money helps create and foster democracy rather than spending American money and lives to take down a dictator.
Yeah. So are those countries more stable now, or have we made about 70 million people more angry at us? And would they be more angry at us given the war we've sent over there, or would they be more angry at us if we had just given them 8,000 a year forever? So in terms of ROI, I don't know which would be better. We've clearly chosen the former.
I've never thought about that, of using a UBI. Like doesn't have to be like a true UBI, just buy them an annuity. Buy them a life annuity.
Yeah, I mean, we effectively have spent that money already. I don't know if we're getting, or anybody's getting an annuity from all of that money already spent. But I can't imagine they'd be more angry at us by getting a paycheck every month.
Yeah.
So the high level point is that's a lot of money. Yeah. And there's definitely projects in the US that money could have gone towards. Again, you can't spend that $6 trillion twice, but it's quite possible that $6 trillion could have supported a lot of the programs that don't really get that funding.
And the spending on wars is actually one of the examples that supports MMT, that when it comes to wars, the government just starts increasing spending. There's no additional tax or additional revenue to support that. There's not a war tax or a military spending tax per se, that when that spending increases dramatically, the tax revenues increase, it's a further deficit. It just adds the deficit, and we've already seen the US government can support that. They've already shown that they can spend that money and it doesn't hurt the economy. It doesn't impact us. Now, again, kind of keep an eye on inflation over the next few decades, but it becomes a fiscal policy decision of, yes, the people we elected to Congress have chosen, and the people elected to the presidency have chosen that this is more important for our society.
Right. So given that 6 trillion has already been spent, and that 6 trillion, again, it hasn't really affected our ability to borrow and spend more. That might be true, but again, that money could have been spent just as easily on other things that might have made our economic growth even higher.
Yeah. So going back to your premise that you'd love for government spending decisions to be evidence-based and using experimentation rather than kind of the passionate emotion argument.
Yeah, I think so. And another way that these deficits or borrowings have been financed by the government is also been subsidized by the government is also the notion that taxes have been going down, as we've mentioned, over the last many years. And these tax cuts, we've also mentioned quite recently that they've disproportionately helped people that are wealthy, or the fact that taxes are lower for the wealthy have disproportionately helped the wealthy. There have been some nonpartisan research to also suggest this, that top 1% we initially talked about, the recent tax cuts from the Trump administration about 20 to 25% of the benefits of that tax cut went to that top 1%. And as we all know, those tax cuts included forever benefits for the individuals who are wealthy, but they included benefits that expire for those perhaps less fortunate on the wealthy scale. So those benefits will expire in 2027. And assuming they don't get renewed, well, that 20 to 25% benefit that went to the top 1%, that jumps to over 75%.
The things that help the wealthy are permanent, but the things that help the less wealthy expire.
Yeah. So if you're in that 99%, oh well.
So before we wrap up, is there anything related to MMT or monetary or fiscal policy that you want to add or point out? Because I do think that this is going to become a bigger part of the discussion moving forward, especially in reaction to the $1 trillion stimulus we've seen during COVID, and with an election coming up in November. I think this is going to be coming up, and just being a little more informed will help you parse those conversations. Is there anything that you'd like our listeners to think about as they are hearing about MMT?
Hopefully it's in line what we've tried to kind of convey here, where it's not black or white. It's not that deficits are bad and surpluses are good and debt is horrible and inflation's not an issue. It's the fact that there's a balance that we have to play. And frankly, over the last 40 years, since 1980 onwards, and so we've done a pretty good job of keeping inflation under control. We haven't seen that high inflation rates of the 70s that we mentioned earlier. But the notion is that we just need to all understand that it's okay to have deficits, perhaps. It's okay to have these long-term debt numbers that continue to grow. But we have to also be cognizant that if we're spending money, hopefully we can spend it responsibly. Just because it's free money, air quotes, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a excuse or it's a option to kind of just burn it.
Yeah. Do you trust Congress to spend money on projects that have a positive ROI?
I trust that eventually there will be a generation that is highly in favor of evidence and using that as a basis for making these types of decisions.
I think that's a great optimistic ending for our conversation.
Sounds good.
Well, thank you for your time, Trishul. Thank you for getting wonky with me today. It's one of those things where I saw Stephanie Kelton present at a conference years ago, and I've been trying to follow. And it's like, okay, I'm glad I know how much I know. I'm also glad that I did not pursue economics as a career.
I think it's helpful to have individuals like Stephanie Kelton provide this type of material that's kind of more accessible and less dry than your standard economics publication. But at the end of the day, yeah, I enjoyed this conversation as well. And it was great digging into some of this stuff. So thanks, Aaron. And thanks, everybody, for listening. And of course, if you enjoyed this conversation, do leave a review and let us know. All right. Bye.
Bye. We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.